Welcome to an RGVSTEAM video on how to assemble a rocket, basic rocketry assembly. You're going to need a couple of things for this. You're going to need some 2-part epoxy, 5-minute quick cure type 2-part epoxy. You're going to need an X-Acto knife, and you may need some sandpaper. You will need some sandpaper. So let's get started identifying the parts. There's going to be 3 fins. They're all identical. Nose cone, body tube, payload bay, coupler, which will insert into the payload bay. Actually, it's going to be glued into the payload bay, and it'll slip fit into the top of the body tube. Motor mount tube. There will be 3 centering rings for centering the motor mount tube into the body tube. A motor retainer. It'll glue onto the back of the body tube and make motor changes quick and easy. Parachute, Kevlar heat protector for the parachute so that your ejection charge doesn't melt the parachute. Hardware, Kevlar cord, which will tie onto a I-ring that will be screwed into the upper centering ring. We'll get to that part later on. Shock cord, which will tie to the top of the Kevlar cord. The Kevlar is so that the heat doesn't affect the Kevlar. The heat will eventually make the nylon brittle. It's going to help prevent any failures. And finally, a coupler, which will screw onto the nylon cord and will screw into this eyelet in the bottom of the bulkhead. All right, that identifies the parts. If there's any additional parts later on, we'll give you another video or we'll give you tips on how those are used. So let's get started. To give you an idea of what's going on, the tab, this is the tab on the fin, is going to slide into the slot in the body tube, and that's what it's going to look like. Now, when the motor mount tube is inside, the tab is actually going to glue to the motor mount tube. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just wanting to show you how it assembles, what it's going to look like basically. First thing we need to do is take the motor mount tube, slide it into the body tube, and while holding it in place, even with the bottom of the body tube, make 2 marks at the bottom and the top of the fin slot. There we have our marks. The purpose of these 2 marks is to show where the centering rings need to be glued. Now remember, the bottom of this mark, since you marked it from inside the slot, is where the centering ring needs to rest. The upper part of the centering ring will sit at the bottom of that mark, and at the top, the centering ring needs to rest above the mark, like such. So what we're going to do is go ahead, we're going to glue the bottom centering ring on last. That's important. So locate the centering ring that has the hole drilled in it right here. That's going to go to the very top. So we're going to start with a middle centering ring. Test fit it, make sure it slides in place. If it doesn't, mine does, but if it doesn't, if it's a little too tight, you might want to take your sandpaper and sand out the inside of the hole. And then if the centering ring doesn't fit into the body tube, sand the outside of the centering ring until it will. You want a friction fit, but just make sure that it'll slide into the body tube. This one does, as you can see, actually quite perfectly with just a little tension. I've got some 150 grit sandpaper, and all I'm going to do is right above this mark. Remember, this is the top, bottom, middle, top. Let's just put a mark so we can remember this side up. So right above that mark, we're just going to rough up the tube just a little bit all the way around where the centering ring is going to mount. There we go. You just need to rough it a little bit. Don't get too aggressive with it. Top centering ring, I'll put it aside. Middle centering ring, I'm just going to give it a light sand on the inside so that the epoxy has some little grooves to grip into. Do the same thing to the outside. It fits fine, so I don't need to remove a lot of material. Just give it a little hit with a sandpaper. Quick little tip about the epoxy. Once you've opened your epoxy, make sure the red tip goes on the red or white, depends on what color your bottle is, but don't mix up the tips, because if you accidentally get epoxy onto the tips and you put the wrong one on the wrong bottle, then it's going to mix the two epoxies and it might glue the tip to the bottle. Also, if you're not getting epoxy out, it's probably because there's a red plug in the top. You'll need to remove that red plug before you can use the epoxy. Screw the top back on, and you're going to need to cut the red tip above. There's a little ring around it. Leave the ring there, because that ring is what the top snaps onto. We'll just go ahead and cut it real quick. And the top can still snap in place. There we go. You'll need to do the other bottle the same way. I'll do that off camera. In preparation for assembly, I've went ahead and slid the middle centering ring down below my mark. I'll put my epoxy and then I'll slide it up so that the centering ring rests just above the mark on the motor mount tube. It's a two-part epoxy, equal parts of part A and part B. I established that by making a line of epoxy and making equal length lines. I like to use these little cardboard tabs. That way I can throw them away once I'm done. I don't know if you can see it well on the camera. You're not going to need a lot of epoxy. Probably a 1-inch bead of epoxy will be plenty. Now I'm going to put down the other part. Same approximate amount. I like to use a popsicle stick for mixing it. Popsicle sticks are available in large quantities at any hobby shop. I'm not going to name any by name, but you know who they are. When you're mixing your epoxy, be sure to thoroughly mix it. Make sure you get all of the epoxy off the stick a couple of times so that one part of the epoxy is not stuck to the stick itself. Make sure everything gets thoroughly mixed. You have 5 minutes, but I recommend you try to be through with your process here in a couple of minutes. All right, epoxy's mixed. Again, this is the top. We're going to apply it above the mark in a circle all the way around the tube. You can actually let it go below the mark a little because the centering ring is going to push it back up. But you don't want any epoxy below that mark after the centering ring is slid into place. The reason being, if it's dry and you're trying to put your fins in place, they're not going to sit all the way in because of the epoxy that's holding them up off the tube. So we've got it down just about 1/8 of an inch below that mark. Like I say, the centering ring is going to push it up. When it does, it's going to form a nice fillet between the tube and the centering ring. Top, let's slide it up into place. We're even with the mark. Now I can see the mark just coming out below the centering ring. Now I'm just going to set it with the top up, and the epoxy will flow down onto the centering ring itself and make a nice fillet. Let that dry. We'll be back after that's dry. While the middle centering ring is drying, we're going to go ahead and screw that eyelet into the top centering ring in preparation for gluing it onto the tube. Just make sure that it doesn't extend beyond the edge of the centering ring. This looks like it's going to be fine, so but I prefer to leave it in that orientation. Once it's glued into place, take a little bit of epoxy and put a dab of epoxy around the threads on the bottom. I mixed up just a little dab of epoxy, and I'm going to go ahead and place it on the threads on the bottom of the centering ring on that eyelet. Try not to get it on the edges of the centering ring at this time. Just get it dabbed around that eyelet. Make it less likely it'll unscrew. Okay, the upper centering ring, got the eyelet screwed into it. We're not going to twist it, but this is dry enough it's not going to run. So we're going to go ahead and carefully glue it onto the top. Remember the top we marked. We're going to glue this onto the top, sliding it just far enough down that we can get a glue fillet on top and bottom of the centering ring. This dimension is not critical. We've already got the glue all mixed up. I've already hit it with a little sandpaper. So we're going to go ahead and put a little bit of glue all the way around it, up close to the top. We're going to do one thing a little bit different here, but I'll show you when we get to that. Try not to get any glue on the inside of the tube. So we'll go ahead and twist this into place. There we go. I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch of the tube sticking up out of the centering ring. Okay, that looks good. Make sure that it's straight. Same amount sticking out all the way around. Looks good. The glue's running down into a very nice fillet. Now I'm going to pick up some more glue on my popsicle stick and put just a very small fillet, making sure not to get it inside the tube. Might have some paper towels handy to wipe it out if you do. Also, isopropyl alcohol, I like to use that also for helping to clean up the epoxy if you get it in the wrong place. Now this glue will still be a little runny for a little while, so I said we're going to do something different. Instead of holding it this way or this way, the glue will run, so we're just going to do a very slow rotation so that the glue will kind of run into a fillet and run around it. It won't all run away from the centering ring. You need to do this for about 5 minutes or so, then the glue will get thick enough that it won't run and it won't be an issue. Okay, let's take a close-up look. You can see we glued this centering ring just above our marks. No glue on the bottom side, glued on the top. You can see the fillet there. The upper centering ring, you can see we have a glue fillet there, and also here. We put a little dab of glue around the threads. So this assembly is pretty much ready. We're going to set it aside, and we're going to put some marks on our body tube so we know where to put our launch lugs. Okay, the next step is to locate two of the fin slots on the body tube. Get about halfway between the two and make a mark with a pencil. So this is where we're going to put our launch lugs, and we'll explain what that is later. Right now we just need to get a mark that's straight up the body tube, and that looks good. So that's done. We don't have to worry about that later on. So you can see how it's all going together now. These centering rings center this tube into this tube. So we're going to do a test fit and just make it sure that it slides in there. We might need to do a little sanding, but let's see if we can get it in there. Yeah, just right. There we go. Nice and snug, but not too tight. We're going to want to slide it in so that the bottom of this body tube is even with the bottom of that. And that's where it's going to sit. Look and just make sure that those centering rings are not extending below the fin slot. And that all looks very good. Nice, nice, nice. You can test by taking the fin, putting it into the slot, and it should slide into place. If it won't, take a look through the slot and make sure that the centering ring is not sticking into the slot. Okay, we're good to go there. Now we're not going to glue the rear centering ring in just yet. And this was just a test fit. So what we're going to do is pull this back out. We're going to put glue in the body tube. We'll measure and see where we need to put a glue ring inside the body tube. We'll slide this back into place and let the glue dry thoroughly before we move on. Now, just to give you a heads up, what we're going to do is probably drill a small hole in the rear centering ring and put that extra eyelet that actually is made to go in the bulkhead. We're just going to use it as a tool to be able to remove this rear centering ring. So we'll put a small hole, we'll screw that eyelet in there so that after we slide this into place, we can pull it back out. Now, let's go ahead and get this assembly glued into place, but don't glue the rear centering ring in at this time. So what we're going to do here is measure. That's 5 3/16, and that is 9 7/8. So you need to get a dowel or something that you can reach far enough in to put a ring of epoxy right above the fin slots, which will be where this ring glues in, and then at the 9 7/8 mark, another ring, so that when we slide it in, I realize it's going to push some of this epoxy up, but that's okay. It'll leave a little epoxy there, then let it dry. Taking the precautions as I indicated to figure out that the back of the tube is even with this tube, and to make sure that the centering ring doesn't extend down into these slots at any point. Alright, so I've got epoxy on my dowel. I'm going to put it in place at the upper mark and then pull it back out to the lower mark. I've got the shock cord tied to the eyelet, the Kevlar cord. We're just going to go ahead and slide this in place. Until it's even with the bottom of the body tube. And then I'm going to put it on a couple of the fins with a cord in between them, just so it can sit there and dry for about 10 minutes. Got a 3/32 drill bit. I've already drilled 2 holes in the rear centering ring, but 3/32 drill bit, 2 small holes directly across from each other. Don't make them too large. That's it. That's just so we have a pilot hole to screw our eyelet into, so that we're going to use this centering ring to keep the motor mount centered in the body tube, so that we can tack our fins in place and have everything come out nice and straight. Once the holes are drilled, run the shock cord, the Kevlar cord, through the centering ring, and then carefully work the centering ring into place just far enough that it is inside this tube and it's over the motor mount tube. Now we're ready to tack the fins into place. I've squeezed out about a 2-inch bead of each of the part A and part B of the epoxy. Again, you want to mix it well. That should be good. Now, we want to glue the fin to the body tube and also to the motor mount inside, but we don't want to get any glue toward the very back yet. So I wouldn't put any glue here or here. I would start about a 1/4 inch forward of the back, apply epoxy to the bottom, to the front, and to the bottom of that extension that's going to be on the body tube. Try not to let too much glue come over the sides, but no harm, no foul. If you get a little bit over the onto the edges, try to keep it right on that bottom as well as possible. Get a pretty good bead of epoxy on there. I'm going to put some on the front. The front part will go up against that centering ring that is in the forward part of the bay there, forward part of the body tube. Now before it starts to drip too much, I'll slide this back in and then slide it forward. Now I'm going to take my finger, have a rag handy. I'm going to take my finger and just wipe that epoxy along the fin. Get it off your finger fairly quick. I've got a rag handy to wipe my finger. Now, sighting down the rocket, you want to hold the fin in an upright position, as straight as possible, perpendicular to the body tube. The body tube's circular, so perpendicular is not the exact term, but you get the point. And you're going to have to sit here and hold it for about 5 minutes. Just hold it here, making sure that the extension, you drew an extension from the fin, that it bisects the center of the motor tube as well as possible, and you'll be pretty close. As I try to wiggle it back and forth, I can feel it already starting to get more difficult to move, which means the glue is starting to set. But I'll hold it here for about 5 minutes or so. We'll be back. Okay, fin number 1 is dried well enough that I can't move it now with my hand. It's been about 10 minutes. We'll proceed to number 2. Just repeat the same thing. So we're going to do the same thing. I'll slide it over the edge so I don't put pressure on that one. In, slide it forward against the forward edge of that hole and get it fairly straight. I'm going to clean up any epoxy that ran out of the edge. I'm going to add more in that area later, so you really don't have to do that, but it's just good practice to keep everything clean. Now before it sets, I'm going to line it up and hold it for about 5 minutes. Make sure it doesn't move, and then we'll repeat for the third one. All three are fairly dry now. If you take a look at it, you can see they're pretty straight. The glue is set well enough now that we can go ahead, grab that eyelet, and pull the centering ring out. If you were careful not to get any glue in this area as you were gluing the pins, it'll come out real easy. Now we're going to mix some more epoxy, and we're going to put some along the edges where the fins contact the motor tube here. We'll put some here. It's hard to see, hard for me to indicate, but here and here, all along that root edge. So I'll turn it where the epoxy flows into the V, and I'll do that and that. Again, being careful not to get any at the back edge where we're going to have to eventually put this back in place. You also, it's an option, but you can also put a fillet where along the body tube, where the fin comes through the body tube, turn it in this orientation and do this orientation and do the lower one. That way the epoxy will run to this side and to this side, but for a rocket this size I don't really think that's necessary. As long as we get a good fillet here and here along the root edge of the fin where it touches the motor tube, I think we'll be fine, because we're also going to put a fillet on the outside along here. And I'll show you how to do a fillet on the outside because we want it to look real pretty. On the inside, we'll just dab epoxy in place along that root edge. Using a popsicle stick will probably be too short, so maybe a long pencil or something just to get it in there. Not getting any back here, and we should be fine. We're going to be putting epoxy along this edge and along this edge. I've already got the epoxy mixed up. I'm not going to be able to keep my hand out of the way, but after I get the epoxy laid in, maybe we can get a shot where we can see it. So I've got a blob of epoxy in there, and I'm just kind of dragging it back and forth along that edge. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Let me get the other one in there real quick. With 5-minute epoxy, we don't have a lot of time to work, so you're going to want to try to get it in there quickly. Ah, there we go. And I'm just pushing it back and forth along that edge, trying to drag the epoxy along. Let me take a look at that. Looks good. Alright, let's see if I can get you a shot where you can see it. We have epoxy along both of those root edges. I got a little bit back here in the back. I'm going to have to clean that up real quick before it dries. You get the concept there. I'm going to hold it in this position, tilted forward a little bit so that no epoxy runs out the back. I'll hold this way for about 5 minutes and it'll set up to the point where it won't run, and then we can do this and this and we'll be through with the inside, and we can glue the rear centering ring in place. Alright, that glue is dried to where it's not going to run. We're going to go ahead and rotate it and do another one the same way. And finally, we're going to do the same thing in the last bay here. So I'm going to get that finished, and then we'll come back when we check to make sure there's no epoxy here on the outside, and we'll glue in the rear centering ring, take the eyelet out, and then we'll coat the rear centering ring with epoxy. I'll show you all that when we come back. Alright, it's time to glue the rear centering ring in place. We're going to want to get epoxy on all of the fin bases on the body tube and on the inside, not inside the motor mount, but on the outside of the motor mount inside the body tube. Get a good layer of epoxy all over everything, and then we're going to slide the rear centering ring all the way until it makes contact with the fins. If you screwed your eyelet all the way through, make sure your eyelet's lined up with a void and not lined up with one of the fins. Don't worry about keeping everything clean back here now. As long as you don't get any epoxy inside of the motor mount tube, you'll be fine. We want to get plenty of epoxy on the body tube, the inside of the body tube, which is what I'm doing now. Give you a better view. Got epoxy on the back of each of the fins. Plenty already. Now I just need to get some on the outside of the motor mount tube. Get plenty on there. Have to work fairly quickly because the epoxy will set, and also you don't want it to all run away from the area we're trying to epoxy in place. That looks good. There, it's inside. Now shove it firmly, carefully but firmly, up against the rear of the fins. I'm just going to tap it in place with this, make sure it's seated well. Check one more time to make sure nothing is inside the motor mount. We don't want to get epoxy in there where our motors won't fit. No, I don't see any coming out on the rag, so we're good there. So now I'm going to take this eyelet out. I'm going to flip the rocket over so that the epoxy runs up against the centering ring, any that may still be running, and we'll let it sit like that for about 5 minutes. Then we'll epoxy the back side of the centering ring, and that pretty much completes that. This is the remainder of the shock cord. You saw the one that we put inside. I'll show you a trick for doing this part of the shock cord when we come back. Okay, before we do the fillets along the fin, I'm going to show you what we did here. Remember, we had this Kevlar shock cord that we tied to the eyelet on the front of the front centering ring. Well, this cord is going to be too short to run all the way out the front of the rocket and then tie the blue shock cord on. So bring the orange, the Kevlar shock cord, out of the back of the rocket, which will make it a lot easier to tie. Tie the knot of your choice, and then run the blue shock cord back through the motor mount and out the front of the rocket. That's the easiest way to do it. So go ahead and run it back through. After you've tied your knot, tying the orange shock cord to the blue nylon. And I like to do it so that this knot is actually inside the front of the body tube. I'll show you that as soon as I get this run through. Okay, it's coming out the front. So now I just move it. Pull the blue cord through. There we go. Now the knot is actually about 4 inches inside the body tube. That orange shock cord is so fine that when the parachute comes out, the shock of that shock cord will push against the edge of the body tube and actually rip it open. The blue nylon is much thicker, which gives you more surface area, less likely to rip it open, which we call a zipper. That's not good. So then, in the meantime, we'll roll the blue shock cord back up and shove it back inside the body tube just to keep it out of our way. We have just a couple of things left to do and we'll be through with the back end of the rocket here. This is the motor mount, the motor retainer. It's threaded. The cap screws onto the threads. Make sure that the threaded end is out, away from the rocket. On this side, you'll see 4 notches. The notches go toward the rocket. This is where we're going to use that JB weld. So let me get some mixed up. We'll go ahead and glue or JB weld epoxy the motor retainer onto the back of the rocket. After that's done, we'll be able to add some epoxy around the body tube where the centering ring meets the body tube, and we'll be finished with the back. Then all we have left is the fin fillets. The JB weld works the same as the 2-part epoxy, it's just stronger. One caveat to this: when you take the cap off, there's a hole punch in the other end of the cap. Use it to puncture a hole in the end of the tube, and you'll be ready to go. Black stays with the black one, the white will stay with the red one. Hole punch. See, the end is not open. Punch a hole. Now it's open and ready to go. Same thing here. You're going to put equal parts. Try to do it left-handed so you can see. Maybe an inch long bead right there. This one's a different color. About an inch long bead of that. Black cap goes back on the black. White cap goes on the white material, which is the red label. Get that out of the way. We dripped a little here, wipe it up. Now, your teacher, your instructor, may ask you to wear gloves, which is not a bad idea. Some people develop an allergy to epoxies after extended exposure or multiple exposures. It's never bothered me, but for safety's sake, you may want to wear some gloves. Now, as you mix it, the white and the black will form a gray. When you get a uniform gray color, you know that the epoxy is sufficiently mixed. Have a rag ready to go so that if any gets into the motor tube, you can wipe it back out. Got my rag ready. That was way more than I needed. We're going to apply it to the motor mount generously. Any that squeezes out below it as we slide on the motor retainer won't matter. It could only help, actually. Matter of fact, if you want to get it all the way to the bottom and kind of form a fillet at the base where the motor mount meets that centering ring, that's just fine. This is a strong epoxy. Okay. Again, with the threads out, notches toward the rocket. Slide it on and spin it a little bit. It'll squeeze out all the excess epoxy against the centering ring. I'm not even going to try to take that out. I'm just going to leave it there as long as it's not going to interfere with the cap screwing onto the, and it does not. So the cap will still screw all the way down. There's no epoxy on here, so we know that it's not going to get up onto the cap, keep the cap from sealing. So we're just going to let that dry. That's going to need to dry for about 6 hours. So just work on another part of the rocket and don't worry about it for a while. I'm going to leave the rocket sitting upright like this until it completely sets. While it's setting, I think we'll start working on the payload bay. Okay, this is the coupler that's going to couple the payload bay to the body tube. Only one side of this coupler needs to be glued. Glue the coupler inside the payload bay only. Be careful not to let any glue get outside, because this side is going to need to slip fit into the body tube and be able to eject from it. The nose cone is going to go on the other end of the payload bay, and inside the payload bay will be where your egg and your altimeter sits. Measure the coupler. Mine is 6 inches long, so at 3 inches I've got a mark. Whatever length yours is, halfway put a mark. That's how far you're going to slide it in to the payload bay. This is the bulkhead. This is what's going to keep the things in the payload bay from sliding out to the bottom when you launch. It's also going to keep any fumes from the ejection charge from getting into your altimeter. So first step is going to be to screw the remaining eyelet all the way in to the bulkhead. With the eyelet fully screwed into place in the bulkhead fitting, we mixed up some epoxy and we put a blob of epoxy, what is that? We put a blob of epoxy on the back side of the eyelet just to safety it in place so it doesn't pull through, less likely to pull through, and so that it doesn't come unscrewed. Okay, the epoxy is set up around the eyelet. Now, when we epoxy this in place, we're going to epoxy it approximately 1/4 inch inside of the coupler. So let's place some epoxy inside the coupler. Try not to get any on the outside, because that will be a slip fit into the body tube. We're going to place the bulkhead fitting inside of the coupler. As even as possible. Then I'm going to invert it so that the epoxy can run back down against the coupler itself, the bulkhead fitting. I've got approximately 1/8 inch all the way around, so it's nice and even. I'm going to just hold it here for a while, maybe 5 minutes or so, until the epoxy sets up. Okay, the epoxy we put inside has set. Remember, we got this mark halfway up the coupler, so now we're going to go ahead and put epoxy inside of the payload bay where the coupler is going to sit. Just run it up in the coupler about 1 inch or so, 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches, and then insert the coupler into the payload bay, twisting it as you go until you reach your mark, and then turn it right side up so that the coupler is down. I've got a roll of paper towels over here. I'm just going to set it on the top of the paper towels and let it dry. Everything's dried up nicely. Our final step is to epoxy this side of the bulkhead to the body, to the coupler actually, not the body tube. So we're just going to put some epoxy in there. Being careful not to get it on the outside of the coupler, which is going to need to slide freely in and out of the body tube. Laying it down on the bulkhead and pushing it up against the coupler. We want to get a nice glue joint here to prevent the coupler from pulling out. That looks real nice. I'm just going to sit it here and let it dry. Alright, the next step, we turn it so that two valleys in between the fin and the body tube are upright. We're going to do a fillet here and one here. When those are dry, we'll rotate it and do two more. So we're going to take this, just kind of draw it down into that valley right there. Draw it along with a stick. And pick up some more and do the same thing. Hopefully we can get both of them laid down before it starts to get too hard. Once it starts to thicken and harden, then it's hard to work with. A little bit more and that one will be done. That's good. Go ahead and get the other one laid in. Alright, we made it with one. I'm not pressing very hard with my finger, just lightly. Let me see how much of a radius we've got. That's about all you need. It's just a small radius in there. We'll let that dry, sitting straight up, and when it's all set, we'll start the next set. Alright, we did the second set of fillets off camera. We're on the last ones now, so mixing up some epoxy over here. That should just about be enough. Alright, that looks good. We're going to let that set up. Once it's nice and dry, we're going to call that part done. Alright, we got some epoxy mixed up. It's kind of hard to point out here. Let's see what we can do. We're just going to be trying to get the epoxy right here between the rear centering ring, and the body, inside of the body tube, without getting any on the motor retainer. It's going to be a bit touchy, but I think we can get it in there. Don't you? I do. Just take our time. I went ahead and put the cap on the motor retainer so that we don't get any epoxy on the threads. We can always pull the cap off and clean it up a little. Alright, that looks good. Give my hands a quick wipe. Pull off the motor retainer cap. And I touched it in a few places. We're just going to wipe the epoxy off of it. That all looks good. We'll just let that dry, and I'm going to let it sit overnight. We'll come back tomorrow and finish up the project. Okay, what we're going to do here, remember the mark that we put along the body from the front to the back, using angle iron or some other method of getting a nice alignment down the rocket. These are the launch lugs that we're going to use. Place that launch lug with the slanted edge forward toward the front of the rocket, the flat edge toward the back. Place it on that mark. Take a piece of sandpaper and just sand the gloss finish off of the body tube in the area where you're going to be epoxying the launch lug. Dust off, get rid of all the dust. We're going to use that 5-minute quick cure epoxy. Also take the sandpaper and just lightly sand the bottom of the launch lug, the edge that's going to meet up with the body tube. And then we're going to glue the launch lug into position, directly centered over the mark that we made, and straight with the body tube. When we put the launch lug on, remember the slanted edge goes toward the front of the rocket. You can see how this edge is slanted. This ledge is perpendicular to the line of the body. So, slanted edge forward. Let's get just a dab of epoxy in the location right on that center line. Have some paper towels handy so that any epoxy that pushes out from under the launch lug, we can wipe away. I'm positioning the launch lug so that it's about a ½ inch from the back edge of the rocket. That's not a critical deal. You can put it however you want it. I'm just going to sight through the center of the launch lug. There's an opening in the center, and make sure it's aligned with the mark on the body, and that looks real good. Wipe away any epoxy that pushed out. Be sure you're wearing gloves when you do this. Do as I say is correct and not as I do. Double check the alignment. The second launch lug will go about 2/3 of the way up the body tube. If you've done your work in your center of gravity, center of pressure prediction software, you're going to want the second launch lug somewhere forward of the center of gravity, and that's the only consideration. I put it up about 2/3 of the way up, and that should be forward of the center of gravity. One last check to make sure it's aligned correctly, and we're just going to let that go ahead. I'm going to hold it vertical and wait for the glue to dry so that it doesn't shift position. Okay, this area where we're going to put the upper launch lug and the upper launch lug itself are already sanded. Remember, slanted edge goes toward the front of the rocket, which is up here now. The epoxy is already mixed up. We're going to go ahead and apply some in the area where the launch lug is going to be installed, and apply the front launch lug into the area designated. Get it aligned with the mark on the body tube. Remove any excess epoxy. Apply some pressure to it. holding it to the body tube. Make sure it's correctly lined, and we'll just make sure it doesn't move for the next 5 minutes or so. If one of the launch lugs is twisted a little one way or the other, it can cause the launch lugs to bind to the launch rail, and that's not a good thing. So make sure they're straight with one another and straight up the body tube. This basically completes the assembly of the rocket. Your rocket is now built. The remainder of what we're going to be doing is actually preparation for launch. Now, our shock cord, which we shove back up in the body tube just for safekeeping, unwind the shock cord till you get to the end that's not attached. We got the shock cord unraveled. The very first step we're going to take, this cloth is a fireproof cloth. It's going to protect the ejection gases prevent the ejection gases from melting the parachute. So run the very end of the shock cord through the slit in that Kevlar fire protector. Pull the shock cord through it until the fire protector is right at the front of the rocket. There's going to be a coupler like this in your kit. Run it through the pre-sewn loop on the shock cord, attach it to the eyelet on the bottom of the payload bay. Get some better light here. And then screw the coupler shut. Measure the length of the shock cord, the overall length of the shock cord down to the body tube at least, and then measure 1/3 of the way. Take 1/3 of that measurement and start at the bottom of the payload bay and measure back 1/3. We're just going to assume it's about right there. We're going to mark the shock cord. Then we're going to take our parachute pay attention to the way it's folded. This is much the same way you want to fold it back up. Take the cords all coming off the parachute. Each one should make a loop. It should be attached to the parachute, come down, and then go back up to the parachute. So that's one. This is two. And this is the third one. Trying not to get them twisted. Take them like that. I suggest at the mark that you made on your shock cord that you gather the shock cord together a couple of inches and make a knot by looping that loop back around. Use it to tie the knot. There you go. This is where you're going to attach your parachute. We attach the parachute by running the cords from the parachute through that hole, the loop, making sure you don't get them twisted, keep them open, and then bring the parachute through the parachute cords. Then pull it tight. That's all there is to it. Your parachute's now attached. Fold it back up the same way that it was folded. If you don't know how that was, open the parachute, fold it in half, bring the ends up to match again so you have a pie shape. Do that. Now take the parachute cords and lay them inside the parachute up to the point where it's attached to the shock cord. Then finish folding the parachute by folding it one more time this way and maybe one more time that way. or fold like that. Not critical. You can fold it any way you want, but that's just one way to fold it up. Make sure it'll slip into the body tube easily. We might even be able to do that. It'll still go into the body tube with no problem. After you have the parachute laid into this basic pie shape, lay the parachute cords up inside the parachute. Fold the parachute over one time there. Now you're going to gather the shock cord together. Lay it inside the parachute. There's our fire protector. Roll the parachute up. If you choose, you can fold that loose flap on the top over. The remainder of the shock cord that's going to attach to the payload bay remains outside. Then place the fire protector over the mouth of the rocket, mouth of the body tube, and push the parachute in, allowing the fire protector to gather around it. Now don't forget this part. Using the coupler that's in your kit, attach the payload bay to the shock cord and screw the coupler up nice and tight. Now just gather this little piece of shock cord, stuff it in on top of the parachute, and place the payload bay into the front of the rocket. If it's too tight of a fit, you need to work on that. It should be just a slip fit, so when the ejection charge goes off, it'll push this out. For the remainder of the video, we're going to be working on the payload bay section where your egg is going to go. The final thing we're going to talk about on this end of the rocket is where to attach your altimeter. And basically we're just going to take a piece of string, heavy duty string, or cord I should say, and you can either run it through the eyelet of the payload bay or run it into this coupler, and we're going to tie the altimeter on with that. We'll get to that in a later part of the video. I'm going to detach the payload bay from the rocket to make it easier to talk about the remainder of what we're going to do. There we go. So the nose cone slips into the end of the payload bay. I suggest that you drill at least 2, if not 3 small holes around the rocket, equally spaced, 120 degrees apart, equally spaced around the rocket, and use small screws to screw into the nose cone and hold it in place, because you do not want the nose cone to separate from the payload bay when the ejection charge goes off. The only thing inside this payload bay is going to be your egg, and you don't want the egg going flying out across the field. That's instant disqualification of the flight. Remove the nose cone from the payload bay. If you've already installed your screws, take them out. Make sure to mark the body and the nose cone so that you can realign them correctly so that all of your screw holes line up. Since I don't have any screws in here yet, I can just remove the nose cone. This is the egg protector that's supplied with your kit. Now, we're not responsible for protecting your egg, so this is entirely up to you if you choose to use it or not. The 2 halves are connected, so you're going to have to separate them. Scissors or a sharp X-Acto knife will do the job. Once they're separated, Align the two halves with the egg inside. Now here's some stuff that you're going to have to supply yourself. This is not a tight fit in the body tube. There's some space there. And also, the body tube's a lot longer than it needs to be to contain just this, your egg. The egg will be the only thing in the payload bay. One thing to keep in mind is that the body is going to accept the nose cone down to approximately here. So make sure you measure and mark how far the nose cone is going to go down into the body, because if you stuff foam in here and don't leave enough room for the egg, for instance, you've got the egg at the very top and you try to push the nose cone in, it's going to break the egg. So make sure that you mark how far the nose cone is going to go in. Obtain some foam to help protect the egg. Fill the payload bay up to where you want the egg to be, and then fill the remainder with foam up to where the nose cone is going to be. That's pretty easy. It all makes sense. You're also going to need to wrap some additional foam around the egg protector. You may want to tape the two halves together. It's up to you how you want to get a tight fit for the egg protector in here. If you choose to just use foam of your own, you do not have to use the egg protector. That's up to you. We just provided it as a convenience. Keep in mind that at the competition, if you remove the nose cone and remove the egg before you're in front of a judge after your flight, you'll be disqualified. You cannot open the payload area until you're in front of one of the judges. Another suggestion I would make is you can stuff foam into the bottom of the payload bay up to the point where your egg is going to be, but I suggest you put a piece of cordage or something, not this cord, I'm just using this as an example, but a piece of cordage underneath the egg and leave it up to the base of the nose cone. It doesn't have to be attached to the nose cone, but leave it close enough that you can reach in and grab it. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to pull the egg out of the front. You see what I'm saying? Just wrap it around the bottom and leave it up here so that when you grab it and pull, the egg will come out. So those are just some tips. It's up to you to find the screws to attach your nose cone. It's up to you to find the additional foam you need to make your egg safe in the payload bay. Don't forget, once you've got your egg in the payload bay, properly secured, you slipped your nose cone in and inserted your screws so that it won't accidentally come off. Do not forget to reattach the shock cord to the base of the payload. Your rocket must come down with all parts attached via this shock cord, otherwise that'll also be a disqualification. This completes the basic assembly of the rocket. I'm not allowed to help you assemble your rocket. I'm not allowed to give you any tips beyond just basic tips that I've already given you. However, if you have some assembly questions and you really can't figure it out via the video or via any of the multitude of online videos on YouTube and Google rocket assembly, basic model rocket assembly, then contact us via email, either Jason or myself. Those email addresses will be at the end of this video, and we'll be glad to attempt to help you out the best we can without violating the rules of the competition. Good luck, everyone. We know you're going to succeed, and we look forward to helping you at the launch. With the motor retainer cap removed, insert the motor ejection end first into the rocket until the lip makes contact with the motor retainer assembly. Now take the motor retainer ring, slide it over the nozzle, and screw it into place, just making it nice and snug. That's it. The next step in preparation for launch is to insert the igniter. The igniter will have some material on this end that's going to burn when we apply electric signal to the ends of the igniter. So what you're going to want to do is split the two wires apart from one another. Once you've started them, you can pull them apart by hand, and then at the very end of each one, for about 1 inch, strip the plastic covering off of the wire. That's good for now. Lightly twist them together. You don't have to do a lot of twisting, just a couple of rounds around one another. That shorts them out so they shouldn't accidentally ignite. I've never had one do that, but still a safety precaution. Now, cap's in place. This is the nozzle. We want to slide the igniter into the end of the rocket. If you slide it in and it only goes an inch just past the flammable material, that's not far enough. It's going to go all the way into the rocket. Once you find the center core of the rocket, it'll slide on in. We're still at that 1 inch mark, more or less. There, it slid in. It'll slide in gently until it stops. Once it reaches the front, see, it's about 4.5 or 5 inches into the rocket. So there we go. Now, keeping it against the front of the rocket motor, just bend it around the nozzle, and there'll be a small rubber band that's supplied, very small, that's supplied with the rocket motor. Use that rubber band to hold the igniter in place until you're ready to launch. When you reach the launch pad and you're ready to launch, you're going to find a wire coming from the igniter assembly that we use to set off the rocket. That wire is going to have 2 clips on the end. At this point, place your rocket on the launch rod. Once it's vertical on the launch rod and ready to go, then separate the 2 wires that you twisted together. There we go. That's why you don't twist them firmly, just a light twist around each other. And then you're going to place the clip, 1 clip on each one of the wires, making sure that when you step away, the 2 wires haven't come back together and touched one another. If they're touching, the igniter assembly won't set off the rocket. So make sure they're separated, but make sure 1 clip's on each wire. That's the basic preparation for launching the rocket. Do not place the igniter into the rocket until it's vertical on the pad. So in other words, don't do this in the pits. If you bring it to the safety check with the igniter in it, you're going to have to remove it anyway. The altimeter that we're going to use to judge the height that your rocket flies to is the Jolly Logic Altimeter 1. It's a very small altimeter, you can see here compared to my finger. Maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches long, not very large. It's going to come with a USB charging cable. USB charging cable plugs into the altimeter on this end and plugs into a computer, laptop, or a USB power supply to charge the altimeter. Instructions for how to use the Jolly Logic are here. We will have coaching at the field. However, you must read this and be familiar with the use of the altimeter prior to coming to the competition. My suggestion for attachment of the altimeter is to either use a piece of cord that will fit through the hole in the end of the altimeter, and then tie that cord to the coupler for the shock cord, or get a small metal key ring, a heavy duty small metal key ring, not one that bends easily. Put it through the hole in the top of the altimeter, and then open up the coupler and slide the key ring onto the coupler, and that should retain it during the launch. It's important that it's securely attached to the coupler so that it doesn't become detached during the ejection, which sometimes can be, we don't see it from the ground, but it can be a fairly tight jerk when the shock cord pulls tight. It's your responsibility to securely attach the altimeter to the coupler. The altimeter will be included in your parts that are there for your rocket, as well as the USB cable and the user's manual. This is a good example of a key ring that'll work for retaining the altimeter. It's small enough to fit through the hole in the end of the altimeter, but it's not easily bent. You don't want to use a key ring that's too thick or it won't fit through that hole, or when you try to straighten it up, it'll break the end of the altimeter. That's not good. Then simply place the key ring into the coupler and tighten up the closure on the coupler, and your key ring is firmly attached. Your key ring holding the altimeter. The instructions are very clear in the booklet as to how to utilize the altimeter. Very simple to use. The instruction booklet's very clear on how it works. Make sure it's fully charged when you arrive at the competition, and you should not have to charge it while at the competition. What do I do at the end of the flight? How do I remove the motor? Well, it's pretty easy. Unscrew the cap, making sure you don't lose the cap. Twist and remove the motor. Caution, the motor may be hot immediately after the flight, so I suggest you wait until you get back to the pits. Wait till the judges look at your altimeter, judge your egg. We record that information. Make sure the engine is cool, the rocket motor is cool before you remove it from the rocket. That's it. Then you dispose of this, or you can save the empty as a souvenir, but it's no longer good for any more flights. Replace the cap so you don't lose it, and you're done. The altimeter works by sensing barometric pressure. Your altimeter is going to be connected just below the eyelet on the payload bay. In order to sense the barometric pressure, the pressure within the rocket tube needs to be at the same pressure as the outside air pressure. So we achieve that by putting some vent holes in the rocket body tube, the booster tube. We need 3 1/8 inch holes spread equally around the rocket. So place the coupler and the payload bay next to the rocket, lining it up to see how far it's going to slide down into the rocket, and put a mark. Try to do it this way so you can see what I'm doing. Put a mark where the payload bay comes down to on the rocket body tube. You can also measure the coupler and then measure that distance on the body tube. Go down approximately an inch to an inch and a half below that and put a mark where you're going to put your vent holes. That one, and then at 120 degree intervals around the tube, we're going to drill 3 holes spaced 120 degrees apart. These will be 1/8 inch vent holes. We have a 1/8 inch drill bit that we're going to use to drill the holes. We're going to start with our first mark. Don't press too hard. Let the drill bit do its work and just drill a hole, making sure that you don't have the shock cord or the parachute or something in front of the vent hole. That would be a bad situation. So I'm making sure everything's pushed below the vent hole location, and let's drill that hole. Now you can take some sandpaper. There's a little ridge on the outside where the drill bit was. Sand it smooth. And that's all there is to applying the vent holes. Make sure the vent hole is clear, that there's no debris from the drilling getting caught in the vent hole. You can either do that by pushing the drill bit back through it again, or any suitable, the tip of an X-Acto knife. That's up to you. Just make sure there's no debris in the hole. That's one. You need to place 3 holes total, approximately 120 degrees apart. I'm going to go ahead and illustrate putting screws in for the nose cone. You want to make sure you put the screws somewhere between the separation point and the bottom of the nose cone. So I'm going to go down approximately 1 inch below the front of the payload bay. Approximately. You'll notice that I marked the payload bay and the nose cone. I'll align those marks and go ahead and drill my holes. Approximately 1 inch down. You're going to go all the way through the body tube and into the nose cone, and then put a screw in that hole, snug it up tight so that it doesn't move while you drill the remaining holes. Don't over tighten the screw because it's screwing into plastic in the nose cone. Just snug it up real nice. I'm just going to approximate the location for my 3 screws. There's a joke amongst rocketeers when assembling rockets. We like to say, well, it's not rocket science. Well, kind of in a way, I guess it is, though. Nice and snug. 1 remaining. The good thing about using approximation to locate the holes is that if you lose your marks on your nose cone and the body tube for alignment, you know that it's only going to go back on one way. If all 3 of the holes were exactly equally spaced, it could line up any of several ways. This way, the holes are only going to align when it's in the correct orientation. But even after I paint the rocket, I like to put a little stripe right here or something so that I can see the orientation of the nose cone to the payload bay. I also suggest that once you assemble the rocket, you put some kind of a mark between the payload bay and the body tube so that you always assemble it into the same orientation. Why? Because consistency is key here. And once you've determined the correct motor, the correct weight, the correct everything to get the altitude you want, you don't want to disturb that by assembling the rocket in a different manner. Repetition, consistency. So there we have it. The rocket is basically assembled. Everything's in place. Now, one last thing I'd like to mention. Make sure that the launch lugs do not line up with the screws or anything on the nose cone. Make sure that that area is clear so that it can slide free of the launch rail without screws being in alignment with these launch lugs.